Hey everyone, this is Thales, and I'm here today to show you how I recorded and produced my version of Blinding Lights by The Weeknd. Let's do it! Alright, this is my project. You're looking at all the tracks that I used to build my remake of Blinding Lights by The Weeknd. Before we start looking at all the tracks, all the elements, all the effects, I want to show you what it sounds like. So how about we listen to a preview right now?
I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I trust. Hey, hey, hey.
Alright, this is what it sounds like, and now let's take a look at all the elements that I used to build this remake. These are just reference tracks, so they're muted. Before I show you the vocals, I want to show you the drums. Let's start with the drums. I'm just gonna loop a random section of the song here, and I'll mute everything else and leave just the drums. Alright, here we go. So for this song, there isn't really a lot going on here. It's just some sounds that kind of sound vintage, because that's what The Weeknd is all about. There's all those synthesizers and vintage drums. So this is what I went for. I wanted this song to sound very similar to the original, even though I sang it 5 half notes below the original pitch. You can see I have my drums grouped here. Everything's going to this one group where I process everything together with some plugins. Before I show you the processing in the buzz, I want to show you the elements. First, I have this snare, which is actually made of 2 layers. So I have this group inside of a group, and the first layer is just a snare without the initial attack, because I like the body of this layer. Here's what it sounds like. And the second snare is more like the transient. Is just the attack part. It's almost just a click, and this is what they sound like together. When I first made the song, I only had the first layer on, but I was kind of missing some transient, some high frequencies in the beginning of the hit, so I decided to layer the second layer. For the first layer, I'm only using a gate, which is cutting the buzz in the end of the sample. And I have some crazy EQ going on here. First, I lowered this frequency where the snare is actually resonating the most. I thought it was too muddy in the mid-range, so I cut a lot of the fundamental of this snare. I also increased 5 decibels in the 5 kilohertz range, just to give it some more brightness. And the cool thing about this is that I'm modulating the pitch according to the velocity just by a small factor. So it makes my snare sound more real, even though it's just a synthesized sample. On the second layer, I just roll off all the lows and mids and leave only the high frequencies. And then I process them in this group where I have this fresh air plugin, which is one of my favorite to increase some of the mid-high frequencies. I have this DSEQ equalizer, which is really good. It's like a dynamic equalizer that can help you shape all your frequencies differently in this spectrum. Let me show you what it looks like when you play. So it's not just an EQ, it's a dynamic EQ, and it works really well. After that, I have this glue compressor that I use to just glue the 2 layers together. Besides the snares in the drums group, I have the kick, of course, and it's a sample with some equalization here, reinforcing the fundamental, increasing a little bit of the low mids, and then rolling off a lot of the mids and high mids. I'm also using Shaper Box, which is one of my favorite plugins, just to modulate the volume. It's like an LFO, because I wanted this kick to lose loudness towards the end of the sample, as you can see when I press play. It's lowering just a bit in the end of the sample, just for some fine tuning. I also have these hi-hats, and I use the stock equalizer just to isolate the frequencies I wanted and to remove this resonance that was bothering me almost at 12 kilohertz. I also have a limiter just so I don't have any peak that goes over the volume I wanted. And I have this auto pan that's just supposed to give my hi-hats some movement so they're not boring and sitting in the center. They're moving around a lot. In this audio effect rack, I also have this second chain, which is just a delay that I use to make my hi-hats wider in the stereo. Let's hear what it sounds like. Can you tell it's moving around? If you have headphones or good studio monitors, I'm sure you can. I also have the crash, which is really just a sample. Nothing really going on here, just an equalizer rolling off all the lows. And this utility, which is just automating the volume according to the section of the song. And if we zoom in here, you see that I have these claps. And all they're doing is helping me with the transition. So they're just like a drum fill just before I transition to another section or to the second phrase of the verse. And I also have two layers. One is just the clap sample that I distorted the hell out of it. And the second is just the transient because I lost my transient when I distorted it. I lost the initial attack, so I layered them both. This is what they sound like together. And this is what they sound like with the rest of the elements.
I said, ooh.
It's just a transition effect. Alright, let's take a look at the bass. This is my bass group. I have a bunch of layers here too. The main layer is this bass body, which is actually, I just flattened the track above it. This is really where the sound was made. It's an electric bass sample processed by Amplitude, one of my favorite plugins to improve guitar sounds. And then compressed a lot. This compressor is almost like a limiter. Actually, it is a limiter. And then I have Shaper Box, which is just doing some light distortion. After that, I have the saturator, which is cranked up to distort this sound even more. An equalizer, just making some small adjustments. Another stock equalizer, which is just an automation to reduce the high frequencies in a certain part of the song, as you can see here. This automation here. And an utility plugin just to cut the sound entirely before we hit the chorus, and also to increase the volume slowly in the beginning. This is what this layer sounds like. Besides that layer, I have a sub bass, which is basically the same MIDI, just pitched down one octave. And it's just an operator, which is one of the Ableton stock instruments, followed by a compressor that has a limiter setting here. So it's basically a limiter. And another gain automation with the utility stock plugin. That's what it sounds like, just a sine wave. Hope you have a headphone or good speakers to hear this. Besides that, there's this cool synthesizer layer that actually shapes the sound of this bass, and it's very vintage, very 80s sounding. That's what it sounds like. It's a serum preset that I tweaked a little, followed by a saturator, an EQ to roll off all the low frequencies because I just wanted the mid and highs from this layer. I wanted the low frequencies from the bass body layer and the sub bass layer. I also have this equalizer here. It's just doing a sweep in the beginning of the song. As you can see here, it goes from low frequencies only to allowing more high frequencies. And then, of course, the utility plugin to run the same volume automation as the other layers. And I have this distorted layer, which is just some extra distortion because it wasn't distorted enough, so I needed more distortion. It's another serum preset that I also tweaked a little just to get to the sound that I wanted, with an equalizer that cuts all the lows and leaves only the high mids and the high frequencies, followed by a compressor, another crazy equalizer here because it was too bright to my taste at some point in the mixing phase. Oh, and there's also another stock EQ, which is in MS mode, which is mid and side. So what I'm doing here is removing this bass sound from the center and putting it on the sides. So I'm just widening this sound. There's another EQ here that does that sweep in the beginning of the song, and the utility with the volume automation. This is what all the bass layers sound like together. I had some buzz processing going on here. I have the DSEQ again, and it's just removing some harsh resonances from the whole group, from all the layers at once. I have another equalizer here that I placed just to make more room for some other elements that my bass was clashing with in the mix stage. I have another EQ8 that is not being used, so I'm gonna turn it off. This one's automated to reduce frequencies around 1K on a certain point of the song. As you can see here, it's just making all the bass layers more subtle during the verse and pre-chorus, so there's more room for the vocals. Speaking of making room for the vocals, I also have this DSEQ here that's being used in a sidechain mode, and it's receiving the signal from the vocal group, meaning my vocals are actually ducking my bass layers. Let's see if we can hear that.
I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel.
So all these specific frequencies that you saw in the spectrum are actually the frequencies from my vocals that are being ducked from my bass. Isn't that cool? It's like that track spacer plugin. And then in the end of the chain, I also have another MSEQ to make sure I don't have any low frequencies going on the sides. Just making sure the sub frequencies and the low frequencies are in the center. Alright, that covers the bass sounds. Moving on to the synthesizers. I have the synth group, and it starts with a pad that was also made in Serum, as you can see. Let's play that. Very cool preset. You may have noticed that I use a lot of presets, and even though I know how to synthesize sounds and I know sound design, I think the best way to produce the most amount of songs in the shortest time possible, it's to try a lot of presets and get started with the sound that sounds the most as what you're looking for, so you don't waste a lot of time on synthesizing each and every sound, but you spend most of your time focusing on being productive because someone already came up with these amazing sounds that are exactly what you need for your track. So even though it's super cool to synthesize your own sounds, and I do that sometimes, I just feel like using presets and just tweaking them fits my workflow better and helps me save time. Okay, so this pad, we're removing all the low frequencies, as we almost always do, so we have enough room for the bass in the mix. And we're also removing the high frequencies, so we really just want the mid frequencies in this pad. And then there's the utility here, twice. It's just some gain automation in the beginning. There's also these keys that I used in the verse. Let's listen to them first. They're just some background keys that I used to give my verse some movement, so it wasn't just singing and drums and bass. It's almost like an arpeggiator, and it was made with Ableton stock plugins. A preset called Carnival 200 Piano. And this instrument rack is just because I wanted to have the same keys being played an octave above with some delay afterwards. So it was a cool effect where the notes were playing in an octave and there was a delay being played one octave above. Later in the chain, I'm using the saturator to distort these sounds. I'm using the Ableton stock equalizer to isolate the frequencies in the mid because I didn't want any lows or highs in this instrument. I have the second EQ that's just an automation that happens towards the end of the song. I turn it on the last section just so I have a different sound in the end of the song. This is what it sounds like. And I have the Valhalla Supermassive That's just a crazy effect. It's like a crazy delay that makes it really spacious. The preset I used is even called 80s space verb. So it's like a delay reverb that sounds like the 80s. I love this plugin, and you can get it for free on their website, valhalladsp.com. And the last plugin in the chain is just a utility that's just automating the volume, as always. Alright, and the main synthesizer in this song are the keys that we used in this section, which happens in the intro and also after every chorus. This is what it sounds like. Sounded a lot like the original, right? This was the hardest thing to do, to actually find a sound that's very similar to the original, that has this 80s feel that The Weeknd seems to have adopted as his style. And it was made with only 2 layers. The first layer is just what I call body of the sound. It's just some thickness. It's actually just this synthesizer. It's very popular, called Synth 1, on its initial sound. And then I made some widening with the Ozone Imager plugin. I compressed it a lot. My ratio is almost 8:1. I have this utility also just automating the volume. And I had this audio effect rack that's just adding a delay to the last note of the riff to make it last longer than the rest. This is what this layer sounds like by itself. And of course, the main layer, the one that actually makes this whole 80s feel come to life, is the second layer, which was also made in the Synth 1 synthesizer. I found this preset that sounded like a trance instrument, like a rave lead, and I made some tweaks to decrease the detuning and change the envelope and messed with the tempo delay until I got this sound, which was very fitting for this song. It's funny that it all started in the trance preset. And then of course I have some equalizer going on here and the Ozone Imager just to make it very, very wide in the stereo field. Alright, that was the synth group. We can take a look at the vocals now. And this was very simple. I don't even have back vocals going on. I have this back vocal group here from another track, but I didn't even add any audio to it, so everything's turned off. And this is my main vocal, in which I separated the actual notes from the sibilants. I separated them in 2 tracks so I could process them separately, as you can see here. I recorded this in my home studio with the AT2020, very good microphone from Audio-Technica. By the way, I separated the notes from the sibilants using this plugin called Melodyne. And I did this in the recording project. So you won't see this plugin in my chain here because it's in a different project. And then I exported those 2 tracks separately and brought them to this project for mixing. Okay, so in my vocal track, I have an audio effect rack with 3 chains. The first one is just my vocals unprocessed. The second chain is a compressor, the stock compressor from Ableton, and it has a pretty high ratio for vocals, it has 4:1. And on the third chain, I have the glue compressor, another stock plugin from Ableton. And what I'm doing here is called parallel compression. It's usually good to make compression more subtle, but you can see that I'm using 3 dBs on this chain, so I'm not being subtle at all. I'm compressing like crazy here. And that's what everyone does with pop songs nowadays, or pretty much everyone. They're almost always over compressed. And it sounds good. That's one of the things I actually love about pop music. Moving on, I have this rack with all my favorite effects for processing vocals. I started with an equalizer just to roll off some low frequencies and actually decrease a little bit of the low mids because my recording was kind of muddy. I have this fresh air, which I'm always using on vocals and sometimes other instruments, just to give my vocals a lot of air. And it's cool because it's not affecting my sibilants, so I don't even need a de-esser. I'm not increasing the S sounds or my breath sounds. I'm just increasing the high frequencies of the vocal notes, and that's an amazing thing to do. I also have the vocal doubler, which is on the maximum configuration, but I'm only using it 60% wet, so it's kind of subtle. Let's hear what it sounds like.
Since it is cold and empty, no one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you go. Oh, and I said, ooh,
turn it on again.
I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't.
Just so it's not entirely mono. The vocal doubler is followed by another audio effect rack. The first chain is just an utility that doesn't even have to be here. It's just to process this in parallel with a delay and a reverb. So I have this pretty quick delay with a subtle difference between left and right just to create more space. And there's a lot of feedback as you can see here, but the volume is not too loud. And then I have a reverb, which is the Thales reverb, a free plugin that sounds really good. And this utility just automating the volume again. On the sibilance track, I only have a utility, a compressor, and another utility that's doing a lot of automation just to remove some breaths, because I always find it better to do it this way than using de-essers. And sometimes I increase the level of some consonants that I wanted more pronounced, like here. Because when I recorded, you couldn't really hear the T in the end of the word. So I decided to boost it just so you could understand what I was singing. And now we covered the vocals. The last thing for us to take a look at is the effects track. It's the last piece in this puzzle. It's what helps glue everything together and make the transition smooth. It's also the last thing I produced. It's the final step. And what I have here is just a bunch of samples of uplifters, downlifters, swells. Everything was produced with this synthesizer called the Riser. It's my favorite plugins to make transitions. And since I didn't want to have 6 or 7 synthesizer tracks in the song, I just made them and then bounced to audio so it wouldn't be as heavy on my CPU. So let me show you what these effects sound like. The first one, a very cool uplifter with some movement. Second effect is what I call delayed crash. This helps a lot with creating impact on your transitions, and it has a compressor just to make the delayed crash sounds last longer, meaning the volume will fade away more slowly. And I have shaper box with the sidechain shape and some panning going on to make this effect move a lot in the stereo field. Next I have these horn sounds that I filtered a lot so they don't even sound like horns anymore, but I still like them. And they're followed by the Valhalla Supermassive. This is what it sounds like. And I also have this quick uplifter here. It's a funny sound, but it's very useful to make transitions. Now this is what it sounds like with the rest of the song.
I can see clearly when you go. And I said,
Subtle but very effective. It would sound very weird without it. Let me show you.
When you go. And I said,
There's just something missing. I also have another uplifter that I used in a different section of the song. It's more aggressive, and it's followed by this noise down effect. The next effect I have is my favorite sound, my signature sound, the ping pong delayed tambourine, which sounds like this. Kind of sounds like you dropped a coin on the floor or something like that. And there's another effect that I used here in this section of the song, which was made with a synthesizer that I already showed you, those keys, remember? In this case, I made them sound differently. It's just a quick burst of notes in a scale that also helped me transition to the next section. That's what it sounds like. Very interesting way to transition. And I didn't come up with this. It was actually in the original song, something similar. I didn't really try to sound exactly like they did and find the exact same notes, but I made it similar enough. And this is what it sounds like with the rest of the song.
I trust. I'm just walking by to let you know.
It is subtle and you hear mostly the tail of the delay, but this is just a detail. It's not something that's really important to be heard, but to be felt. So that's it. Those were all my instruments and samples. I have some return tracks here. First one's a reverb, and I'm using the Ableton's new reverb effect. That's really cool. It's called Hybrid Reverb. Everyone should try it out because it's very useful. My second return track is another instance of this supermassive, Valhalla supermassive. And the last one is just for some vocal automation. I have a delay and a reverb and a compressor on a chain. Alright, in a master chain, I have two equalizers doing some precise work here, reducing some frequencies that were bothering me and increasing some other frequencies to my taste. As you can see, it's very subtle. When you work in the master chain, you don't do 5 dB increases. You do 1, 2 dBs, 3 at the most if you're being really aggressive with your mastering. After that, I have the DSEQ, which I use just like people use that Soothe 2 plugin just to reduce some of those resonances that could be kind of harsh. Then it's followed by the Voxengo TOT. I don't know if they named it because of the OTT preset from Ableton, but this plugin is really cool to balance your frequency spectrum. It's like a compressor and an expander at the same time, and it works in many bands. I'm using this setting with 64 bands. It's really interesting. Let's play a section of the song and look at this plugin and see what it's doing. It's actually cutting and boosting many frequencies over time. So it's a dynamic equalizer with up to 64 bands, which is crazy. Next in the chain, I have the unlimited, which is my limiter for the master chain. I'm not really doing anything here. I just want to limit the peaks. And then I have the span, which is my favorite plugin for analyzing the spectrum and to see if it's balanced. Sometimes my ears are just not enough. I need some visual help. It helps me make some mixing and mastering decisions, but I always trust my ears better in the end. And then after the span, I have this utility here. That's just automation to decrease the volume before the chorus and then increase it right in the transition to the chorus, just for some added impact, and also a fade in the end of the song. And I'm also automating the width in the stereo. So I decrease it slowly during the verse and pre-chorus, and I increase it all of a sudden when the chorus hits, just to make the song real wide in the chorus for some added impact. And that's it. Those are all my tracks. This is how I remade the song Blinding Lights by The Weeknd. I hope you liked it. Please subscribe to the channel. Leave your comments below if you learned anything on this video or if you have any suggestion, any plugins that you think would help me that would be useful for producing this kind of sound. And I see you next week with the next song that I'll sing and remake for you.
I've been on my own for long enough. Maybe you can show me how to love. Maybe I'm going through withdrawals. You don't even have to do too much. You can turn me on with just a touch, baby. I look around and since it is cold and empty, no one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you're gone. I said, ooh. 'cause I can see the sun light up the sky. So I hit the road in overdrive, baby. Oh, since city's cold and empty, no one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you go. Oh, oh, nothing. Ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I trust. I'm just walking by to let you know I could never say it on the phone. We'll never let you go this time. I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. Oh, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. Hey, hey, hey. Hey, hey, hey. I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch.